Thank you, Erin, and thank you all for joining us for development of the IEP. If anyone would like to introduce themselves in the chat, feel free to include your name, where you're joining us from, and if you want to say anything about your role. As Erin said, my name is Ann Wilson, and I'm on the staff here at Peak Parent Center, and I work on a variety of projects. And I'm also a parent, and so I've been through the IEP process, and so I may add parent perspective at certain points. And if Erin, if you want to jump in at any point, feel free to, if you want to add any information. So this is part 2 of a 3-part webinar series. The first part was last week. We talked about some IEP basics, evaluations, and eligibility. Today, we will talk about development of the IEP and the contents. And then next week, I hope you'll be able to join us for implementation of the IEP and advocacy. A brief recap of some of the things we covered last week. We talked about the purpose of the law and how eligible students receive a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. The role of evaluations and how you request an evaluation. And then we talked about how not all students with disabilities will have an IEP, but so there is an eligibility determination. And then we talked about the members of the IEP team. There are some required members, and then there are some optional members, and that includes the parents, not less than 1 regular special education teacher, not less than 1 special education teacher, school district representative, and a person to explain the evaluation results. There's some situations where you may not have a particular person. For example, if a student doesn't participate in regular education classes, then you wouldn't have a regular education teacher, but in general, those are the required people. And then there are optional people, including related services staff, others who know the student, and that's the important category of people who can come to the meeting if you need people to provide just some support or another person there, or if you want to have someone with, if you want to have an advocate or something, they would come under that category. And then finally, the student. And I mentioned how important it can be for the student to attend the IEP meeting, even if they can come for part, to share their perspectives and start to develop that self-advocacy. Today, we'll be focusing on the content of the IEP. And in general, the IEP will be looking at where the student is currently, that baseline, and then talking about where you want to go in the next year and the plan to get there. Schools do use a data management system to document the IEP, so you will see a similar template for your IEPs. And just want to make sure that you're paying attention to each of those sections that we'll go over. And then you also, at the start of your IEP meeting, should always be receiving your procedural safeguards. I know that can feel like a large document that's hard to get through, but that does really have important information about your rights as a parent. And so you do want to hold on to that and have that available. And again, the parent advisors at Peak Parent Center are always available if you have some questions. I want to start with this image, which is from our CDE Alternative Dispute Resolution Project, which we'll talk more about next week. But this is just a nice graphic that kind of outlines the process and what you'll be talking about in the meeting. It always starts with an evaluation. You look at present levels and needs to develop measurable goals for the year. And then you will describe the services in the least restrictive environment, including accommodations and modifications. And hopefully that will all come together for a plan of supports to achieve that educational benefit that we're looking for. Before the IEP meeting, parents must be given notice, which includes the purpose, time, and place of the meeting, who will be attending, and that parents may invite others to the meeting. And this notice must be translated into the family's home language. And this is just an example of what your notice might look like. So the IEP includes very specific contents. And so this is just a list, and we'll look a little more into each of these. So you'll have present level of academic and functional performance. You'll have measurable goals. a description of how the child's progress toward meeting those annual goals or progress monitoring, a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary services, a description of modification and accommodations, if you have those, an explanation of the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular class and in extracurricular and non-academic activities, and that's the least restrictive environment piece. And then you'll have a service delivery table with the projected date for the beginning of the services and modifications, the frequency, location, and duration of those services and modifications. So it starts with the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. That's sort of your baseline. This section for the title has a lot of different parts, but you will have, this is where you'll include information on the student's strengths, preferences, and interests, their present levels of performance, student needs and the impact of the disability on their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. And this is the section that includes parent and student input. Again, I really like to emphasize that student input as well as parent input. So even if you're, as a parent, providing that information, you want to try and get input from your student. Even at the youngest ages, they can communicate things that are working and not working. You can talk to them about strengths, interests, preferences, and needs. When my child was younger, I used a website called I'm Determined. It's imdetermined.org, and they actually have a nice little graphic that you can use that has a little table with strengths, interests, preference, and needs. And so we would actually find pictures and place them in there, and he could present that at his IEP meeting. So there's lots of different ways to get student input, but don't forget that it's parent and student input, not just parent input. So when you talk about strengths, preference, and interests, make sure strengths are listed in the IEP and utilized throughout the IEP. We want to build on strengths. Here's an example of a statement you might have, and this is just an example, but think about things that you can include about things that the student enjoys, circumstances when they like to maybe write more or what they like to read. This can be a great way to give the team more information. So the example is Mario enjoys reading chapter books. He prefers books about sports. He likes to write mystery stories. He learns well in cooperative groups. He can remember information he has heard. He's in the video club at school, and he takes karate lessons. So think about these types of things, because this can give the team ideas for things they can work. If you're having trouble with writing, maybe you could work a mystery into it. And especially things that they're doing outside of school that they might not be aware of, that can just give them more information of the context the student is working from. Next, you'll talk about needs and the impact of disability. When IDEA was reauthorized in 2004, this was updated to say present levels of academic and functional performance, to emphasize that it's not just academic needs. And so you'll have needs for academic, behavioral, social skills, assistive technology, which is important and you definitely don't want to overlook. And then as it becomes more relevant, you'll look at independent living skills and job-related skills. You will also consider needs for children with visual impairments, hearing impairments, communication needs, and English language needs. These needs should be action and child focused, not a description of what is wrong with the child. So you want to have your needs describe something that the team can work with and work to develop that skill. For example, you don't want to say something like the student is never on task. You might say the student needs guided notes to help them pay attention or something like that. Here's some examples. You might say Mario needs to fluently decode words with more than one syllable. And that's more specific. You wouldn't want to say Mario needs to read at grade level, although that's certainly a goal. You wouldn't want that as the description of your need, because it doesn't give you that actionable language that you need. Another example, Jamie needs opportunities to communicate and engage in age-appropriate activities with non-disabled peers. That would be preferable to saying Jamie needs friends, even though we want Jamie to have friends. And I just want to point out this particular language where it talks about activities with non-disabled peers, that ties to the least restrictive environment idea of having students with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible. And so we talk a lot at Peak Parent Center about inclusion, and I think that's something that a lot of parents look for. But inclusion, the word inclusion is not part of the law. And so keep in mind, if you're thinking about inclusion, to be thinking about needs to do things with non-disabled peers, because that ties more closely to what the law says. You'll use those needs to develop annual goals. The goals have to be measurable. They include academic and functional goals, and they're designed to meet those needs that you just developed. So you start with the baseline, determine the needs, and then develop the goals, what you're going to try to achieve over the next year. Again, it's based on the needs so the student can be involved and make progress in the general education curricula. That comes back to how special education supports the general education curricula. And then other educational needs that result from the disability. You want to make sure that the annual goals are measurable. It sounds like that would be clear from the requirement for measurable annual goals, but often people will have goals that actually aren't measurable. So the goal should cover the who, what behavior you're looking for, to what level or degree, under what conditions, and in what length of time. So a common format might be by whatever date, student will be able to do the desired behavior in the specific context as measured by, and you'll have to fill that in with some measure. Sometimes it's a percentage of accuracy, and then you might describe what reports. For example, you might say, when given a list of 10 vocabulary words, student will correctly define and write them in a sentence 4 out of 5 times with 90% accuracy. So SMART goals, if you haven't heard of SMART goals, are the main type of goals in IEPs. I think most goals are SMART goals. They must be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and relevant to address those needs, and time limited. And in the IEP, we naturally have a time limit of 1 year. Keep in mind, we sometimes tend to default to quantitative data when we're thinking about how things can be measured. And then, but it's also possible to use qualitative data. And also think about, we'll talk about progress monitoring, but also think about how that's going to be measured, and is that something that works well in the classroom. Here's an example of an annual goal. Mario needs to fluently decode words with more than 1 syllable was the need we mentioned. So the goal could be Mario will read a 5th grade text with 95% accuracy at a rate of 75 words per minute. That's a goal based on the current baseline, that Mario reads 3rd grade texts with 97% accuracy at a rate of 68 words per minute. This is an example. If anyone wants to note in the chat whether these goals are measurable. One example, Mario will improve his writing skills. This will be measured by teacher observation. The next is Monica will learn multiplication facts 0 to 12. This will be measured by written and oral testing. And John will improve his ability to stay on task and pay attention. This will be measured by teacher observation. And so none of these goals are measurable, but you may see goals like this in IEP. So this does happen, and something to pay attention to. Short-term objectives are required only for students that take alternative assessments aligned to alternative achievement standards, and I'll talk more about that. But you can still ask the IEP team to write short-term objectives, or at least break up your annual goal into shorter timeframes to have a clear roadmap of steps to reaching annual goals. And sometimes those milestones might correspond to the timing of progress monitoring, which is the next section that we look at. So the IEP must include a description of how the child's progress toward meeting the annual goals will be measured and when periodic progress reports will be provided. So these are some questions that you want to ask if it hasn't been covered. You want to know the how is progress going to be measured, when it will be measured, and by whom, and how often parents will receive a progress report. This is often tied to grade reports that the school does for all students, but it might be a different schedule. And then how will the report be delivered? Email, sent home with student, by mail. I think this is increasingly being done by email, but some schools have portals. So just make sure that's all clear so you don't leave with questions. Sometimes the team will get kind of busy trying to move through things, and so there might be open questions that no one asks. So if you check to make sure these things are covered. Then you will move on and have a description of a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services that will be provided to the child or on behalf of the child. Related services includes things like speech language pathology, audiology services. It could be interpreting services, psychological services, could be physical therapy or occupational therapy. It might also include recreation. Those are just examples. It might include other things. And then supplementary aids and services, keep in mind that they do include supports not just for the classroom, that can also include extracurricular and non-academic activities. And when you are looking at instructional methods, they need to be based on research to the extent practicable. Supplementary services would include accommodations and modifications, but they can also include direct services and supports to the child, and they can also include support and training for the staff that works for the child. For example, if you have a student who needs a specific kind of assistive technology, and that's been part of what's been determined, you might need to include training for how to use that technology or things. So if you do come up with something that requires that the team knows something they don't, that might be a place to have support and training for the staff. So when we talk about accommodations, we're talking about changing the how the student receives instructions or shows what they have learned. So you're not changing the content, you're just changing how things are done. Again, you have accommodations if you need them to participate in all general education activities and extracurricular activities. Some examples of accommodation include it may be extra time for exams, a small group setting, audio recordings. You might need large print size, reading of test questions in exams, guided notes. You can also have alternative responses for exams. Some people, might be using speech to text. It might be providing a verbal response rather than a written response. And then you will also need to have a statement of your accommodations for state and district assessment. Modifications change what the student learns. So modifications may change the actual content, not just the how things are delivered. Again, you're looking if these modifications are needed for the student to participate in all general education activities and extracurricular activities. We'll talk about this in a minute, but if the student requires modification to state standards, they may also require alternate assessment. And there is a requirement that parents understand the implications of alternate assessment, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. And then you'll have your service delivery table. This tells you the date services and modifications start, how often, location, and duration. That's something that I always kind of jump to and check on the IEP to make sure I agree with the number of minutes it specifies and things like that. The frequency of services need to be adequate to meet students' needs and can result in the child reaching their goals. This sometimes can be hard to determine. So that might be an area where you think you've made a good plan, but then maybe either they don't need as much as you thought, or maybe they need more than you thought. So that's something that you might need to bring up with your team along the way. You will also make an ESY, or extended school year determination. This is something that some students with IEPs participate in. It's students will be eligible for extended school year services, which are services beyond the normal school year, often in the summer, and it's in accordance with the IEP. The determination is decided based on looking at regression and recruitment data. And so you're looking at whether there's a concern that the student will lose progress, that they won't be able to make up when they return from the break. It's not designed to teach new skills. And there's a link in the resources at the end of the presentation with more information about the extended school year. As I mentioned, alternate assessments for students with significant cognitive disabilities. The IEP team may determine that the student qualifies for alternate assessments. And there is a requirement that parents be informed about the difference between regular and alternate assessments and the effect of these, including if taking alternate assessments affects the students, something it has implications related to graduation. And so sometimes when these decisions are made, that might seem far off, but make sure you're thinking about the long-term effects of these, not just the taking the exam this year. Sometimes I hear that from families that they feel like this decision's made too early. Sometimes people make the decision and feel like they didn't necessarily understand the long-term effects. So just ask questions if you have. There's some links to information. Sometimes when you're early on in the process, sometimes people will say, don't worry too much about that. Let's get through this. But you know, we have to balance. We have to think about what's going on now and also where are we headed. The least restrictive environment, again, the IDEA provides that a student with a disability must be educated with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. And so in this section of the IEP, you include an explanation of the extent to which the student is not participating with this non-disabled children. So this highlights the preference that as much as possible, we want the student participating in those activities. And again, keep in mind that placement refers to the services that the student will receive and the educational environment in which they're learning. It's not a physical location. So sometimes people think of those terms as being interchangeable, but it's not. This is just a diagram to show you the continuum of alternative placements. The most restrictive is being homebound or in a hospital. Then the next would be a residential facility. Then the next would be a special school, and then a separate classroom. And then the least restrictive is considered the general education classroom. And then within the general education classroom, you'll have some percentage of time. And so a lot of students are served in the regular classroom more than 80% of the day. Or sometimes they'll be between 40% and 80%, and sometimes it will be less than 40%, but those are sort of the percentages that they look at. Colorado has a pretty high, it does pretty well on that standard on the number of students that are included at 80% of the day. Transition components. In Colorado, beginning at age 15, no later than the end of 9th grade, the IEP must include post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessment related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills. And then they must include the services that are needed for the student to reach those goals. IDEA specifies 16, but states can provide an earlier age. So this is one area where in Colorado that age is 15. This is when you're required to have those transition components in your IEP, but it's never too early to start thinking about those things and what you're working toward. Sometimes the process is long, and the earlier you can start sort of building some foundational exposure and things like that, that can really help. When you have your transition meeting, which is your IEP meeting, but it's just an IEP meeting that includes transition meeting, or you might, depending on the situation, might have a separate meeting, but it could just be your regular IEP meeting. The student must be invited. So when you're considering post-secondary goals and transition services, the student must be invited. If there's some reason that the student doesn't attend, the school must ensure that their preferences and interests are considered in planning. And then when appropriate, the school, with the parent's consent, must invite a participating agency likely to provide or pay for transition services. And so there's a lot of agencies that might be involved with transition. For example, you might be working with DVR if you're working toward employment. You might have other needs where an agency is involved. You might have funding from your community center board. So there's different people who might be involved at that stage. Also, keep in mind that IDEA requires school districts to provide accessible versions of instructional materials to students who are blind or otherwise unable to use printed materials. Timely access to those materials, and then the school must take reasonable steps to provide these materials at the same time as other children receive their instructional materials. A common one of these is sort of getting audiobooks. I think that's getting easier now. There's a lot more audiobooks available, and there's a lot more ways to do that. But making sure that your student gets the materials they need in addition to their supports and services. Prior written notice is something that happens all the time, that parents must receive prior written notice from the school each time the school proposes or refuses to initiate a change relating to the placement or the provision of FAPE to your child. But you want to keep it in mind in the IEP meeting as well. There is a section of the IEP document that's prior written notice. And so if you discuss something in the meeting, and if you as a family request something and the school says no, you want to document that in the prior written notice. And that can also be helpful, even though we have these set roles of who attends the IEP meeting, the people who are in those roles change year to year. Sometimes they change during the year. And so even though you have an IEP team as you go through education, there's different people involved. And so that can also be a way to kind of keep a record of what was discussed and what you considered. So if you're moving on to another school, they can look at that and what was the reason you didn't do that? And maybe there's, something to reconsider, or you can also see why it wasn't considered. So don't forget about prior written notice in your IEP. There is also a process that allows for the IEP to be amended or modified without the complete IEP team. If the parent and school agree, and the parents are involved with writing the amendments, the IEP team must be informed of the changes, and then parents have to request a copy of the IEP with the amendments. Make sure that everyone serving the child gets a copy of those amendments. And then once again, really consider before agreeing to amend without all the IEP team members. Sometimes there's a small thing. For example, I've had an amendment where we changed the frequency of a service or something, and it only affected one provider, and then but if it's something that you want the whole team to be doing, you don't necessarily want to do an amendment without all the IEP team members. So just consider the circumstances and think who needs to help carry this out, who needs to have input on this. And if there's more people, then you might want to have an IEP meeting. Parent participation, or we often refer to as meaningful parent participation, is a really important part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Parents are team members, so parents must always be invited to IEP meetings. Um, Parents are equal participants in team processes, and that's we talked a little bit about last week is, everyone has a role and everyone has important information to share. And so it's not something like you're coming into a classroom and they're going to tell you things. I kind of thought that when I was new to the process. I thought, okay, I'm going to go and listen and they're going to tell me things. But parents are really equal participants and your input is really important. That's why it's included. Parents are also the protectors of the student's IDEA rights. It is, however, the school's obligation to propose an IEP that provides FAPE. And if you remember, there is a timeline in which they have to propose the IEP and they need to stick to their timelines. If you're unable to come to agreement and they have to propose an IEP, then you can object to the school's proposal. And then next week we'll talk a little bit about the dispute resolution option. Also, keep in mind that if you do invite a lot of people bring advocates to meetings, or if you bring someone in that's going to support you in the IEP meeting, they don't replace your voice. It's still the parent voice that it's the parent that's a part of the team and the parent who's a mandatory part of the team. So even if you bring in people to help with the process, remember that your voice really matters. We like to end with tips for participating in meetings with every session. Remember that it's okay to feel emotions. They're a natural part of the human experience, and this process can be very emotional. Have a friend or an advocate go to the meeting if that would be helpful to you. Take a break if needed, and it's okay in the meeting to say, can we take a break? Or I think I need a break. Some people like to have a recording of the meeting because there's a lot of information that happens. Some people get a little nervous when you are recording the meeting. So do, as a courtesy, ask if it's okay to record the meeting and explain your reason why you want to record. Sometimes people think that is a sign of not trusting the people at the meeting. And we do want to have conditions of goodwill and hope that we trust each other. So it's great to ask before you record. Keep the focus on helping your child and ask for time to think about big decisions and for time to review the IEP after the meeting. It's also, if you're in your initial meeting, you won't, you may not have drafts beforehand, but it's helpful to get drafts of the IEP if you can. It's not a requirement that you be given drafts, but it can be very helpful to review the drafts because there's a lot of information, and if you can review them ahead of time, it can make your meeting more efficient. So ask if it's possible to get a draft before the meeting, but understand that they don't have to give you a draft before the meeting. More tips for parents. Build relationships with your IEP team members. Know when your written consent is required. There are those times you do consent to the evaluation. You need your consent to the initial provision of special education services. When you're in the IEP meeting, you sign an attendance sheet, which shows you are at the meeting. You don't sign the IEP to show agreement with the IEP. That's not part of the process in Colorado. Use a parent input form or other method to think about parent and student input in advance. Always make sure your goals are specific and measurable. I think it's surprising sometimes that goals do get by that are not specific and measurable. And use Peak as a resource for questions. It's wonderful that Peak has one-to-one parent advisors that you can call and ask specific questions. There are also a lot of other resources to support families, and Peak can also help you find those resources. And so that ends this presentation. But next week, we'll talk about implementation of the IEP and advocacy. I hope you'll join. I think that's a really important piece because we meet sort of once a year, maybe more, but really this is ongoing through the school year. And the more we can work well together, the better the results are for the student. Save the date. Peak Parent Center has our 2023 Conference on Inclusive Education back in person after a couple of years of virtual. on April 17th and 18th. That'll be in Denver, and that's a great way to get more information. It's really helpful if you can kind of go beyond the IEP and support your students or learn more. The more you learn, the better you can support your students. So that's a great way to get more information and resources. And this is a list of those resources, the ESY services there and some other resources that can be helpful. Here's our Peak Parent Center information. It does not include the parent advisor email, which is parentadvisor@peakparent.org. That's a great resource, and if you do have questions, take advantage of that. Let's see.
There are a couple of questions. Where can we find the registration links